There is a version of World War II you were taught in school. The good guys won. The monsters were punished. Justice was served. The world moved forward. And then there is the version that the American government sealed inside classified vaults for 3 decades. A version so morally devastating that when it finally surfaced, historians struggled to find the language to describe it. This is that version. I need you to stay with me here, because what I'm about to walk you through isn't speculation. It isn't conspiracy. It is documented history, confirmed by declassified files, government admissions, and the testimony of the scientists themselves. And once you understand what was done, and why, and by whom, you will never look at the post-war world quite the same way again. Let's go back to the spring of 1945. The war in Europe is collapsing around Hitler's Reich. Allied forces are moving fast from the west. The Americans and British are racing through Germany. From the east, the Soviets are thundering toward Berlin. Everyone on the Allied side knows the end is coming. But alongside the military advance, a different kind of race is underway. A quieter one, a more dangerous one. American intelligence units, specifically a group operating under the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the JIOA, had been given a mission that had nothing to do with liberating concentration camps or capturing war criminals. Their mission was to find the scientists, not to arrest them, to recruit them. This program would later be known to history as Operation Paperclip, and it would become one of the most consequential and morally compromised decisions the United States government ever made. The scientists in question weren't ordinary they weren't innocent academics who happened to be working in Germany during the war. Many of them had been members of the Nazi Party. Several held SS ranks, and some of them had done things inside German laboratories and concentration camps that, by any civilized standard, should have placed them before a war crimes tribunal, not inside an American university or a U.S. Army research facility. But the Cold War was beginning, and the United States government had made a calculation. A cold, rational, utterly chilling calculation. The Soviets were also hunting German scientists. The Americans could not afford to let that knowledge fall into Soviet hands. And so, quietly, methodically, and in direct violation of President Truman's own executive order, banning the employment of individuals with Nazi affiliations, American intelligence officers began falsifying the records of these men. They scrubbed their files. They removed references to SS membership, to party affiliation, to the experiments. They gave these men clean bites, and then they brought them to America. Let me tell you about some of the experiments, because this is where the story becomes almost impossible to process. And yet, you need to know. Inside the concentration camps, primarily Dachau, Auschwitz, and Buchenwald, Nazi doctors conducted what they called medical research. The quotation marks are mine, and they are intentional. What happened in those rooms was not medicine. It was torture with a clipboard. At Dachau, prisoners were placed in low-pressure chambers designed to simulate conditions at extreme altitude. The goal was to determine how high a pilot could fly before losing consciousness, and at what point death became inevitable. The subjects were not volunteers. They were Jewish prisoners, Soviet Poles, Polish civilians. They convulsed. They hemorrhaged. Some died slowly, their lungs filling with fluid, while German physicians took careful notes. At Dachau, they also conducted hypothermia experiments. Prisoners were stripped naked and submerged in tanks of ice water. Scientists measured precisely how long the human body could survive. When subjects lost consciousness, some were rewarmed to study which methods worked best. Others were left to die. The data was meticulous. The suffering was deliberate. The intent was purely military, to help German pilots and sailors survive cold water immersion if they went down over the North Sea or the English Channel. At Auschwitz, Dr. Josef Mengele, who would escape justice entirely and live out his days in South America, ran experiments on twins, dwarfs, and people with unusual physical characteristics. He injected chemicals directly into children's eyes, attempting to change their color. He performed surgeries without anesthesia. He sewed twins together, attempting to create conjoined siblings. The children who survived his procedures were often left permanently disfigured. Many did not survive. At Buchenwald and Neuengamme, prisoners were deliberately infected with malaria, tuberculosis, typhus, and mustard gas. The point was to test vaccines and treatments, but the subjects were given no choice and no protection. Hundreds died. The data, however, was preserved. And this is the point where the story takes its darkest turn, because that data, the product of torture, of murder, of crimes against humanity, was considered extremely valuable by American and British researchers after the war. The hypothermia data in particular was debated fiercely in the scientific community. Some argued it should be destroyed, that using it would legitimize what had produced it. Others, and this view, horrifyingly, often prevailed, argued that to discard the data would mean the victims had died for nothing, that the ethical path was to use the knowledge to save future lives. That argument is still debated by bioethicists today. It has no clean answer, but in the immediate post-war period, the practical result was that much of this data found its way into American military research, and so did many of the scientists. Hubertus Strughold is perhaps the most significant example. Known in post-war America as the father of space medicine, Strughold's research was foundational to the U.S. space program. Astronauts who flew in Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo capsules benefited directly from work he helped pioneer. He received honorary degrees. He was celebrated at banquets. His name was placed on an award given by the American space medicine community. What his American admirers preferred not to discuss, what his declassified files eventually revealed, was that Strughold had been present at a 1942 conference in Nuremberg where the results of the Dachau altitude experiments were presented. He knew he was, at minimum, complicit. His name appeared on research that drew directly from the data produced by those experiments on living prisoners. He was never charged. He died in San Antonio, Texas, in 1986, having lived a long and professionally distinguished life in America. Terry was Wernher von Braun, whom you may know as the architect of the Saturn V rocket, the machine that took American astronauts to the moon. Von Braun was not merely a technical genius who happened to work under the Third Reich. He was a member of the Nazi Party and an officer in the SS. He oversaw the production of the V-2 ballistic missile at a facility called Mittelwerk, a factory built inside a mountain, staffed entirely by concentration camp slave labor from the nearby Dora camp. Thousands of prisoners died They died from exhaustion, from beatings, from deliberate cruelty. Some were hanged in the factory itself, their bodies left suspended as a warning to others. Von Braun, he was aware of the conditions. A survivor later testified that von Braun had personally selected workers from the Dora camp. When the Americans captured him in 1945, all of this was known or knowable for those who chose to look. Instead, his SS file was removed. His party membership was minimized. He was brought to America, eventually given citizenship, and placed at the center of NASA's rocket program. When Apollo 11 landed on the moon in 1969, von Braun was celebrated as an American hero. He died in 1977. He was never charged with any crime. Walter Schreiber was a German general and physician who oversaw much of the Nazi regime's biological and chemical weapons research. After the war, American intelligence brought him to the United States, where he worked for a period at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine. His presence became public in 1952, when a journalist at the Boston Globe reported on his past. The resulting outcry forced the U.S. government to quietly relocate him to Argentina, not to try him, not to imprison him, simply to move him somewhere less visible. Kurt Blum was another physician who had overseen Nazi biological weapons research, including work on plague bacteria and cancer weaponization. He was tried at Nuremberg and acquitted, in part because American intelligence officers wanted to protect him for their own research purposes. He was subsequently employed by the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A man who had overseen Nazi biological weapons research was acquitted at Nuremberg, in part because American intelligence wanted to use him, and then was employed by the United States Army. This is documented. This is in the records. Dies Up in it, the British ran their own parallel program. Operation Surgeon brought German aerospace engineers to the United Kingdom. The Soviets conducted Operation Os, in which they forcibly relocated thousands of German scientists and their families to the Soviet Union, some willingly, many not. The Americans were not alone in this, but the Americans had the most resources, the most ambition, and ultimately absorbed the largest number of the most significant figures. By the time Operation Paperclip formally concluded in the late 1950s, more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians had been brought to the United States. Some were untinted. Many were not. And the records that might have told the full story were classified, sealed, and kept from the public for decades. The first serious cracks appeared in the 1970s and 1980s, when investigative journalists and historians began filing Freedom of Information requests and piecing together the documentary record. Linda Hunt's 1991 book, Secret Agenda, based on thousands of declassified documents, laid out the program in unprecedented detail. The response from the American government was largely silence. In 2010, the National Security Archive at George Washington University published a cache of newly declassified documents that confirmed, in government's own words, the extent to which Nazi affiliations had been knowingly concealed. The Justice Department's own internal report, partially declassified that year, concluded that the United States had indeed employed former Nazis in intelligence and scientific roles, and had actively worked to shield them from prosecution. By then, most of the men in question were dead. Here's the question I want you to consider, and I don't think it has an easy answer. Was it worth it? The Saturn V rocket that went to the moon, was the knowledge embedded in that achievement worth the price of what produced it? The space medicine research that kept American astronauts alive, was it acceptable to build on data extracted through atrocity? The Cold War advantage gained by denying these scientists to the Soviets, did it justify the moral compromise of importing men who should have faced justice? I am not going to tell you what to think. That is not what this channel is for. What I will tell you is that the men who made these decisions were not cartoons. They were not ignorant of what they were doing. They were intelligent, serious people operating under enormous pressure, in a world where the Soviet threat was real and the stakes were genuinely high. And they made a choice that said, in effect, the future matters more than accountability for the past. That strategic advantage is worth moral compromise. That some crimes can be quietly absorbed into the machinery of progress. That choice shaped the world you live in. It shaped the technology that surrounds you. It helped put human beings on the moon. And it meant that men who participated in torture, who watched prisoners drown in ice water and took careful notes, who walked through factories where slaves were being worked to death, those men lived out their lives in American comfort. They received awards. They gave speeches. They died in their beds. The victims of Dachau did not. Before I close, I want to acknowledge something. This story is uncomfortable for a reason. It does not fit the narrative we prefer of a clean moral victory, of justice served, of the good guys winning completely. History, real history, is messier than that. And the discomfort you might be feeling right now, if you're feeling it, is not a bad thing. It is what it feels like to look at the past honestly. There is more to say about this. The biological weapons research, the psychological experiments, some of which continued on American soil, on American citizens, under CIA programs in the 1950s and 60s. The full thread runs much further than one video can follow. If you want to go deeper, and I hope you do, the sources are there. The documents are declassified. The records are real. This is not a story that lives in the shadows anymore. It lives in the archives, waiting for people willing to look. Thank you for watching. If this kind of history, unfiltered, documented, honest, is what you come here for, then subscribe, because there is a great deal more where this came from. The past has not finished speaking, and neither have I.